Garfield, everyone's favourite big orange cat. Today, I tried to make a sculpture. It was supposed to be an owl. Somehow I screwed it up and I turned it into Garfield. Let's see how I did it. The main reason that this sculpture went wrong was simply because the wings were too small, but also the body was in a very not dynamic pose. I did draw it out beforehand, but it just didn't look right when I actually transferred it over to a sculpture. Like I usually do, I just was wrapping it with clay, but in the end I did use way too much clay compared to the actual size of it. It just didn't look right. And usually how I combat that is just to add a bunch of clay and just hope for the best. Unfortunately, sometimes that is just not enough though. The wings were the main problem as to why this didn't work, which is funny because it was the only part salvaged for Garfield. I had to redo them 3 times, and they still were wrong in the end. For my first try, I cut out each feather from a slab of clay, but the main problem was that I didn't add a wire in between them. So in the end, they didn't work and they were too floppy. When the first try didn't go to plan, I wasn't too bothered. I hadn't wasted too much time just yet. For the second try, I rolled and cut out a slab and then cut each feather from it while already being attached to the big wire. It had the same problem as the last one where there weren't any wires in between each feather. At this point I was bothered. I just ended up making a wing without recording it because I didn't think this time would work either. But to my surprise it did. This time I did use wire in the bigger feathers, which made it more stable, which is why this one did work out. I used my round and pointed mini fingers to create small slits for feather-like details, which ended up looking really nice in the end. Going across the wing, each feather got smaller, and I ended up doing 3 rows of feathers, again, which got much smaller by the end of it. I think what threw me off most about this sculpture was the fact that I couldn't actually tell that I didn't like it from the start. A lot of the time I can detect kind of when a sculpture isn't going to work out by the end of it, but this one I couldn't. I thought that it looked actually half decent by the start of it, and I think that was kind of why it didn't look good in the end, because I didn't realise my mistakes and I didn't fix them. But in the end I think it really kind of ended up well because I got Garfield out of it. I don't know why out of all things I chose Garfield from an owl. I looked at the wings and thought, oh, I'm going to make Garfield out of this. Oh, also, look at these little feathers. I made them so small. Aren't they so cute? Oh my gosh, I love their little feathers. Whoa. Now, I didn't actually realise that the wings were too small until after I baked them. And I think that was where I kind of went wrong with it. I didn't, put it up to the main sculpture and scale it to see if it would work. And I baked them, and I didn't realise until very late into the sculpture that it wasn't going to work. These little things were cabochons. I used them for the eyes of the owl, and they actually they look quite nice. Again, another reason as to why I'm kind of upset that this one didn't come out too well. You see now, look at the wings. Look how ridiculously small they are compared to the body. And then I realised, and I started to take it apart. And instead of trying to make it again, I just scrapped it. I just took it apart, and I was bored, and now it's Garfield time. Because of course I wanted this to be smaller than the owl, I wanted a smaller base, so I drilled 2 holes in this one to hold up the tail. I didn't have a plan for this one. All I knew was that I wanted to use the wings from the old one and make Garfield. So I did. I didn't want any exposed wood, so I put a clay slab down, stuck it to the base, and then I started to work on the body. So I started with some metal wire and some tinfoil. And I have made Garfield before, believe it or not. So I used him as a reference. As per usual, I rolled out some clay and put it on the foil. To make his tail, I rolled out a line of clay and cut a slit down the middle, and then coated it along the wire. I made the tail a lot longer than Garfield's would usually be, simply because I wanted it to hold up the rest of Garfield. Like the owl, I did end up using quite a bit of clay to bulk out the head and the body. At this point I did start to kind of realise what the plan I wanted for this one. And I wanted Garfield to kind of be slightly off the ground with his arms out. Just like the tail, I rolled out some clay and put it over the foil. Ah! At this point you can actually tell just how long the tail is, but in the end, it doesn't actually look that long. When making feet, usually I'd put some foil in the middle, but I forgot to. It didn't change much. If anything, it kind of made it a bit easier. I gave him his signature little toes using my mini finger and just kind of squeezing it in there. Like the legs and like the tail, I rolled out some more clay, cut it in the middle and put it over the wire. The wire! Not the foil, the wire. Making his hands was actually quite difficult. I had to put a little ball at the end and then just kind of add his fingers one by one. I had to do a lot of going back and forth because his hands look way too chubby. Which is weird saying that for a cat that's known for being a little bit chubby. I do recommend cutting things on a surface, not on your hands. I did make his ears a little bit too big at the start, so I did end up cutting off some in the end. I used this knife to flatten out his ears, which worked quite well. His wings did actually end up looking quite well, which I'm really pleased about because, you know, they're owl wings. They made him look like a little angel, which he is not. I tried a few different ways of making his mouth, but in the end I went with this one where I just cut it out and put it on, and then do the eyes afterwards instead of first. I didn't measure if the eyes were going to be too big, I just kind of went back and forth and cut off any clay if they were too big. I finally put Garfield in the oven, and at this point I was actually kind of struggling to see Garfield with his eyes closed instead of open because I already have a sculpture of him with his eyes open. So in my mind he just right now looks like his eyes are open, but they are closed. Now, usually on sculptures with no physical texture, I do struggle to get quite a smooth coat of paint on them. So I tried something slightly different and used my sponge, and it actually worked quite nicely. It gave it a little bit of a stippling effect, which you can't actually see, it's more of a feeling, but it worked really well. Something I've found is actually with characters that are simpler, it's harder to get them to look more recognisable to what it actually is. And that's, I think, mostly because the less detail you have in there, the kind of more you notice when something is even slightly is off. But I think it did still come out quite well. I did mess up here a little, and instead of doing a darker coat first, I went straight in with the white. The only reason that this is kind of a problem is because I wanted there to be shading in between each of the little details in each feather. So it's best to do a darker colour first, then dry brush a lighter over the top. So you see now I'm kind of going over the white. and then I have to go over with white again. That's the problem. And it wastes time and makes it look a bit chunky. Luckily I do notice this before starting the other wing, so I can start off with the darker colour. To dry brush, all you need to do is just get a minimal amount of paint on your paintbrush and gently wipe it over the details. It'll make the darker colours stay in the cracks while bringing out the raised areas. It definitely looked better on the second wing because I didn't screw that one up. I also added slightly lighter tips at the end of the feathers just to add a bit more detail. This part was one of the most infuriating pieces of the entire sculpture. I screwed it up so many times, and the problem is it's black. I couldn't go over it easily, so I kind of just had to run with whatever mistakes I made. It didn't turn out too bad, but the eyes were horrible. I screwed up so bad that Garfield ended up looking a bit emo. But then I did manage to actually fix it in the end, but it took so many more paints of coat than was necessary. I used one of my sculpting tools, a little ballpoint tool, to add the black markings on his back. And I know they're uneven, and I know they're not great, but actually, if anything, it's better than my other Garfield sculpture, so I'll take that as a win. I did a similar thing for the tail, but used a paintbrush instead. I didn't have a plan for the base, so I just made it similar to the wood. Just made it brown, really. And after all that, Garfield? I don't know what to call him. Garfield ascended? I don't know. Garfield is done. The wings are uneven. The spots on the back are uneven. But in the end, I do actually really like how this one turned out. As silly and as stupid as it is, it's a good sculpture. I can admit that. I like it. I love Garfield, and I'm glad that I turned an owl, out of all things, into Garfield. I don't think I'll ever be able to replicate such a great mistake again. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate that you've stuck around this long. I know, out of all things, Garfield is very exciting. If you would consider it, maybe like and subscribe, only if you want to. Have a great day. Bye bye!